Mr. Ambassador, it's a real honor and privilege to have you on the Shalom Show.
Oh, glad to be with you.
So many of our viewers admire you as one of the real true statesmen in this day and age, so we're really honored.
No, I appreciate the invitation to be with you.
I'd like to ask you how you see the level of how critical the current state of affairs is.
Well, I think that the election that the United States is going to have in just a few weeks is the most important we've had in our lifetime. I think there are obviously not just domestic economic issues at play, although those are at the top of the agenda, but issues that are critical for America's national security, for our friends and allies around the world, and for international peace and security. I think we've been pursuing a very dangerous foreign policy the past 4 years. I think it's left America weaker in the world. I think it's left our friends and allies more at risk. I think the war against international terror has not been prosecuted effectively, and I think the threat of nuclear proliferation is growing. So I think it's absolutely critical that we get new leadership in the White House.
Many people echo that thought, and I'd like to ask you, some people are saying that this event in Benghazi, as an example, is actually worse than that of the hostage situation in Iran many years ago. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's worse by definition. 4 Americans are dead. That's a tragedy, and it's a failure by the administration. I think in large measure it's explained by the ideology of the administration. They couldn't understand or wouldn't understand that the war on terrorism is not over, that al-Qaeda has not been defeated, that the fall of Gaddafi didn't bring sweetness and light to Libya. And that screen over consciousness, that ideology that prevented them from seeing facts that all others could see, led to a desire not to have increased security in Libya, led to the increased risk for all of our personnel, and if anything, invited the attack. So this is a symbol, I think, of a failed policy, a policy that doesn't adequately protect American interest. But in many ways, it could well be 1979 all over again. I don't think the threat to our embassies in the Middle East is gone by any stretch of the imagination. That's why the importance of this election is so striking, because I think with a different policy, with a Reaganite policy of peace through strength, you would have a very different environment in the region, and we'd be much closer to achieving long-standing American objectives.
So many of our viewers are very concerned with the state of Israel and its position in the world. Would you say that currently Israel is in greater danger than before?
It certainly is in greater danger. Not only are its borders less secure, but as Iran approaches its long-sought goal of a deliverable nuclear weapon, the very existence of the state of Israel is in jeopardy. This really is an existential threat. Ariel Sharon, I think, was the first person to call this risk that of a nuclear holocaust. But he's exactly right. Israel is a small state, as we all know. Half a dozen nuclear weapons, there wouldn't be any state. And it doesn't take much to see what the Iranian leadership has in mind. They've held conferences in recent years with titles like The World Without Israel. So when you do strategic analysis, it's not that complicated. You look at capabilities and intentions. They've stated what their intentions are. They're close to having the capabilities. We either wake up in advance or we're going to suffer the consequences.
Is Israel as important an ally to the United States as ever?
Well, I think it's more important. It's the only stable democracy in the region. It alone faces the threat of an Iranian nuclear attack in the short term, but it's also demonstrated that it's a stable partner in the Middle East, and there are many Arab governments that don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons any more than Israel does. So the possibility, if we can get past the imminent threat of Iran, both as a source of nuclear weapons and as the world's central banker for international terrorism, I think that the prospects for stability in the region are not completely gone, but they're being dissipated because we don't have effective American leadership.
So in this day and age, honesty is more important than ever, and to be realistic and be in touch with reality. What are your thoughts on what some people allege is a cover-up with regard to the tragedy in Benghazi?
Well, I understand why people looking at the way the administration has handled the tragedy in Benghazi could think that, because the story that the administration has come up with doesn't hold water. The attack on the consulate in Benghazi, the attacks on our embassies around the region were not caused by some movie video trailer. The attack in Benghazi was a planned terrorist attack. Others were directed by radicals. It was, after all, the 11th anniversary of September the 11th. That's not coincidental. And I think the administration's unwillingness to admit that has given some people to think that there's a cover-up going on. Myself, I think it's much more likely that it's ideology, which puts a screen over the administration's ability to process facts from the real world. They can't admit that al-Qaeda is not defeated. They can't admit that the war on terrorism continues because the terrorists continue to attack us. And honestly, I'd prefer that for the sake of our country, that it was a cover-up, because that would at least indicate the administration comprehends reality, even if it's trying to obscure it. The ideological explanation worries me if there's a second Obama term, because that inability to deal with reality is very dangerous for the United States.
Many regard the outrage throughout the Arab world as feigned and just a pretext for hooliganism, as so many times before. Before we conclude, sir, what message would you have for Jewish voters at this time?
Well, I think the issue of America's relation with Israel has never been clearer. I think the Obama presidency is a radical departure from the bipartisan American policy we've followed with respect to Israel since the modern state was created in 1948. Obama has distanced himself from Israel publicly, given encouragement to adversaries of our relationship, failed to deal adequately with the threat of terrorism, failed to deal adequately with the threat of the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and another 4 years is going to leave us in a very, very dangerous security situation in the Middle East. So to me, the importance of getting a change of leadership in Washington, important as it is on the economic issues, is absolutely critical for America's national security and for the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Sir, this has been a great privilege and an honor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
Thank you, sir. I'll be right back.